In the last lecture, we have seen how Emperor Constantine IV was able to resist the offensive of the Caliphate navy against Constantinople. However, after this great success, a new threat materialized, posed by a new enemy, the Bulgars. Who were they? Answering this question gives me the opportunity to spend a few words on the country named after them. A country with a rich stratification of civilizations. In the ancient world, the region approximately corresponding to modern Bulgaria was called Thrace, Thrake in Greek. The origins of its inhabitants, the Thracians, are lost in the mists of time. To give you an idea, in 1972, world's oldest gold treasure was discovered in a necropolis near Varna. Its sophisticated object date from more than 4,000 years before Christ. The Thracians spoke an Indo-European language. Their ancient civilization had also some influence on that of their neighbors, the ancient Greek. The god Dionysus and the poet Orpheus are examples of myths of Thracian origin. The civilization of the Thracians was not based on cities and on writing. Therefore, the ancient Greeks regarded them as barbarians and at times as enemies. The Thracians appear in Homer's Iliad as allies of King Priam of Troy. Herodotus wrote that they sided with the Ecumenical king Xerxes when he invaded Greece in the year 480 before Christ. He noted that the Thracians were, after the Indians, the most numerous population in the world known to him, and that only their lack of unity prevented them from being a great power. The Greeks founded a few colonies on the coast of Thrace. One of them was Byzantium, the name of which, by the way, is also of Thracian origin. Shortly before the Hellenistic period, Thrace was conquered by Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. Later on, it became a client state of the Romans and then a province of their empire. Under the Romans, the region flourished, also profiting from the trade on the Danube, which formed its northern border. The use of Latin became widespread, although the Thracian language continued to be widely spoken. Then came the crisis of the 3rd and the 4th century. The region suffered the invasion of Germanic peoples moving west before the approaching Huns, and eventually of the Huns themselves, invasions that ultimately led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. However, Also, the empire of the Huns collapsed shortly after the death of Attila in 453. This created a void in Central Europe, in consequence of which the Slavs who inhabited what is today Poland, Belarus, and part of Russia began to move west and south. They were farmers and shepherds looking for better lands in which to settle. Very numerous, they flooded the entire Balkan Peninsula during the 6th century. The Thracian language was submerged by this tide, together with the Illyrian one. Only fragments of it survived in few short inscriptions of uncertain meaning, and in some ancient names of people and places. We can find information about the ancient Slavs in the works of Jordanes, Procopius, and Theophylact Simocatta. Those who live on the west of their vast territories were known under the Latin name of Sclavene, Sclabenoi in Greek, whereas those who live near the Black Sea were known as Anti. Both were feared as warlike people, unwilling to live in cities and brutal in their conquest. Procopius left us a well-written description of the Anti, much in the style of Herodotus. It is also a scary description, as it ends with the public tortures by which the Anti killed their prisoners. Although they were a warlike people, the Slavs were foot soldiers, mainly armed with battle axes, javelins, and small shields. They lacked the cavalry of the steppe nomads. For these reasons, they were subdued by the Avars, who in the 6th century practically took the place of the Huns in Europe. The Avars had come from Asia and settled in the plains of Pannonia. For nearly 2 centuries, their raids spread terror in the Balkan Peninsula. At the peak of their power, in the year 626, they besieged Constantinople in alliance with the Sasanian army. They camped in front of the Theodosian walls, but could not get through. After this failure, the power of the Avars started to decline, and the Slavs were able to form in the Balkan Peninsula their first state. As we have seen in Lecture 9, during the war against the Persians and the Avars, Emperor Heraclius had obtained the support of Turkish tribes. Originally living in Central Asia, these tribes had over centuries moved westwards to the steppes north of the Caucasus and the Black Sea. They were atavic enemies of both Persians and Avars. To the Avars, they somewhat resembled for the physical aspect, with broad cheekbones and almond-shaped eyes. and their way of life, typical of the steppes nomads. To add a touch of color, I can add that at least their hairstyle was somewhat different. Whilst the Avars tied their hair in long braids on their chest, many Turkish warriors shaved their heads but for a ponytail at the top. Towards the year 630, several Turkish tribes formed a federation under the command of Khan Kuvrat, who kept good relationship with Emperor Heraclius. The tribes of this federation were the ancient Bulgars, also known as Proto-Bulgars. They dominated the steppes of north of the Black Sea, a region that the Byzantines called the ancient Greek Bulgaria. There does not seem to be consensus on the origin of their ethnonym, which strikes me for the similarity to the name of the Volga River, but I leave the issue to people more competent than me on the subject. Anyway, after the death of Kuvrat in 642, this large federation of tribes came apart, pressed by the expansion of another Turkish people, the Khazars. The Bulgars moved westward, led by the sons of Kuvrat. Towards 670, one of them, Asparuk, passed the river Dnieper and settled with his tribes to the north of the Danube Delta, while another son of Kuvrat led other Bulgar tribes further across the Balkans. As it had happened with the Avars and with the Huns before them, the Bulgars prevailed on the Slavs because of their horses. They rode since early childhood and had superior archery skills. However, the Slavs were incomparably more numerous and ended up assimilating the Bulgars over the next 2 centuries. The language of the Bulgars disappeared, as it had happened to that of the Thracians. But let's go back to Constantine IV, who, concerned for the arrival of the Bulgars on the Danube, came to the decision of stopping a possible invasion with a preventive attack. After concluding the peace with the Arabs in 680, he led a 2-pronged expedition, naval and terrestrial, against the Bulgars of Asparuk. The plan was to crush the nomads in a pincer movement. While the imperial fleet landed on the Black Sea coast north of the Danube Delta, the Byzantine cavalry, after reaching the north of Thrace, crossed the Danube from the south. However, things did not go as planned. The Bulgars managed to avoid direct confrontation with the imperial army, while the marshlands of the Danube Delta slowed down the Byzantine army. During the campaign, the emperor became ill and returned to Constantinople. Eventually, the imperial troops decided to turn back without having won a decisive battle. However, just as they were crossing the Danube, the Bulgars suddenly attacked, inflicting them serious losses. In the pursuit, the Bulgars crossed the Danube as well and continued to chase the Byzantine troops in Thrace, where they finally occupied the areas of Varna. Thus, Constantine's expedition ended up in provoking the invasion he had tried to prevent. The Slavic tribes of the region south of the Danube submitted themselves immediately to the Bulgars. So, a new Slavic Bulgarian state came into existence in the territories of the empire. The emperor was obliged to sign a peace treaty with this new state in 681, in which he even agreed to pay annual tributes to the invaders. It was a humiliating setback for Constantine, suffered by a new enemy, now dangerously close to Constantinople. From then on, the Byzantine emperors will have to deal with this new state and face several wars against it. But let's now go back to Constantine IV. He had the merit of putting an end to the controversy with the Roman Church, which had begun 40 years before with the doctrine of monoenergism. As we have seen, this doctrine had been an attempt to reconcile the various Christian communities of the provinces that Heraclius had taken from the Sasanian Empire. However, after this victory, in the course of very few years, the world had changed completely. The Arabs had conquered all the territories taken from the Persians. Of the 5 patriarchates that had been once guiding the Christian ecumeny, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem were practically gone. It was time to acknowledge the reality and to avoid at least a conflict between the remaining 2 patriarchates, Constantinople and Rome, a conflict exacerbated by Heraclius' ecthesis and by Constans II Typos. In lecture 16, we have seen how the conflict with the Pope on the Typos ended with Constantine's father, Constans II, with a showdown of Constantine's father, a showdown that ended with the elderly Pope Martin I arrested in Rome, taken to Constantinople, put under trial, humiliated with ridiculous accusations, mistreated by insolent judges, and then sentenced to death. His priestly clothes were torn from him in presence of the emperor. Then Martin, who was ill and could barely stand, had an iron collar put around his neck and was led like a dog through Constantinople by a chain attached to it. preceded by the executioner who brandished his axe. Once arrived on the public execution place, the death warrant was suspended by Constance. How kind from him. Who sent the old man to die of hunger and hardship in the Chersonesus, that is the Crimean Peninsula, which was a typical exile land of the Byzantine Empire at the northern border of the empire. An ugly page which Constantine IV had the courage to turn. Thus, after consulting with Rome, Constantine called in Constantinople the sixth Ecumenical Council in the history of Christianity. It lasted from November 680 to September 681. Constantine presided the long council, conducted theological discussions, joined 12 of its 18 sessions, and ended up being acclaimed as the protector and the interpreter of the true faith. In fact, he made a complete U-turn with respect to his father Constans and his grandfather Heraclius. The council elevated to a dogma the doctrine of the two energies and of the two wills of the Christ. The Patriarch of Constantinople, in office, George acknowledged his mistake and adhered to the dogma. The ecthesis and the typos were condemned by the church, as well as their, by then deceased, ecclesiastical authors and supporters. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Sergius and Pyrrhus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, Cyrus, and even Pope Honorius I, who had tried to compromise with Heraclius. The excommunication of a pope was an unheard of act, which remained unique in the history of the church. And not without consequences, although they were not immediately evident. Poor Honorius, who built or restored several churches in his relatively long pontificate, became more famous for what he did after his death than before it. About 1,000 years later, at the time of the Reformation, some humanists found out about the excommunication of a pope by an ecumenical council. This long forgotten pronouncement became a weapon in the hands of the critics of the dogma of papal infallibility and caused rivers of ink to flow, more than any other issue in the previous 1,500 years. This is an example of how the declaration of a pope remain even today sensitive stuff. One of the few shadows of Constantine IV's reign was the reappearance in his family of the discord that had affected the family of his father and that of his grandfather. His father excuse me, his father, Constance II, had namely committed fratricide, and many people believed that his grandfather, Constantine III, had been killed by his half-brother, Heracleonas. Actually, the problem of Constantine IV had been created by his father. In a society where conspiracies and military uprisings were frequent, Constance II, who feared the rivalry of his own brother Theodore, in order to exclude any possibility that he might one day become emperor, had appointed his own 3 sons as his co-emperors, which, by the way, didn't prevent him to order the execution of Theodore a few years later. Now, having more than one emperor to report to was not bad for Byzantine senators and generals, because in case of controversies among the emperors, they were able to choose to support the contender who would grant them the highest reward. After the death of his father, Constantine had been forced to recognize, nolens volens, that his 2 brothers had his same rights on the empire. Therefore, the Byzantine coins of the time carried the effigy of 3 emperors. When, after the great political success of the Ecumenical Council, Constantine decided to take the opportunity of excluding his brothers from their imperial rights, he was confronted with the opposition of the Senate and the military, at least of some of them. In 681, however, Constantine proceeded with iron determination. In 681, besides depriving his brothers of their rights, he ordered them to, in order that they had their noses cut. This disfiguring mutilation was meant to prevent the victims from ever covering public offices again. Then he had the representatives of the Anatolian team executed because they had expressed their opposition to his plan to become the only emperor. This brutal act put an end to the cases of multiple emperors, which began at the time of Heraclius for a very specific reason that we have seen. They ended there after 3 generations of fratricidal conflicts. Constantine IV died in 685 when he was only 33 years old. He saved Constantinople from a major attack and marked the first stop to the territorial expansion of the Caliphate at the expense of the Roman Empire. An expansion that had been going on for nearly 50 years. He healed the relationship with the Church of Rome, which had been tense uh, uh, for during nearly 4 decades, an act that required considerable political courage. He passed um, um, his he passed the control of the empire, the power to his son Justinian II, who also found himself as a 16 years old emperor, as it had been the case with his father. With Justinian II, the autocratic tendency of the empire will go a long step further. And we will dedicate another lecture to one of the most unsettling figures of the empire history, Justinian II. For now, thank you for your interest and see you soon. A presto.